Dan Mahar, I think we should have taken the Saginaw Spirit approach to this week's episode of the OHL podcast. We record this on Sunday night at the end of the weekend's action, but there is a hell of a football game happening right now in Buffalo between the Bills and the Ravens. And you know as well as I do that there was a big football game in Michigan on Saturday. So the Saginaw Spirit, smart marketing department there, moved the start time of the Spirit Storm game back to 4:00 in the afternoon on Saturday so that fans could get home in time to watch the Lions. Unfortunately, that didn't end so well for Lions fans, but all I'm saying is there's a great football game. And it's not that I don't love doing this podcast and love the audience that supports it, but there's a good football game going on right now.
Yeah, well, as a Lions fan, I can tell you how painful yesterday was, but I think the Bills fans amongst us, neither you nor me, I don't think, but are probably quite happy that they're not recording the podcast right
now. I have softened over the years on the Bills. I used to take my dislike for other teams a lot more seriously than I do now. Although, talk to me about the New England Patriots and I might get my back up a little bit. As a Steelers fan, it's tough, but I'm watching those fans in Buffalo during a snowstorm, freezing cold weather, and they're out there supporting. Tell me a little bit more, because I was kind of pulling for the hard luck Lions too. I mean, they've been hard luck their whole history. And what in HE double hockey sticks happened in their game against Washington?
Yeah, no, I don't want to be defeatist, but with the injuries they had on defense, I kind of saw this coming a mile away. Their last couple games of the regular season, they couldn't stop much, couldn't stop the run. They just too many injuries back there. And when you're relying completely on the offense and it's Jared Goff, yeah, you're flipping a coin in the playoffs. So, yeah, I could see this coming. It's unfortunate because I think fully healthy, I think that team was going to be a tough out.
All right. I'll take it from you because I didn't follow it nearly as closely once my Steelers got eliminated, which was only a matter of time, the way their playoff futility has been lately. But enough of that. It's not the NFL podcast. It is the OHL podcast. The very best and the very brightest in this league, Dan, had a chance to strut their stuff in Brantford this past week at the inaugural Connor McDavid OHL Top Prospects game, moving away from the CHL wide game and making it an OHL only event under the banner of one of the best to ever come through in Connor McDavid. What are your takeaways from the Prospects game?
Well, it's always a heck of a game, right? Because they're all trying to show something. And what I love about this is some people are confused who aren't followers of junior hockey. They watch it and they say, well, this is the absolute best of the best. Well, no, it's, for one, it's draft eligible. So they're younger. They're mostly 17. I know there's a couple of overagers in each team. But, and the other piece is a lot of it's projection. These are kids that NHL scouts and teams want to see. So you get some kind of understated 17-year-old defenseman, the Caleb Deitch, you got Bedkowski. You've got some of these players that aren't high profile, but NHL teams are projecting, 5-6 years out, and they see a lot of promise in these kids who are, stay-at-home defenders, maybe on a bottom pairing in the OHL right now, but will be big players in the future. So my takeaway was that it was great to showcase some of these kids you don't hear a lot about and see how the NHL teams think of them.
I had the opportunity to not only be in attendance, but do the radio broadcast for the Prospects game. And in watching this one, I got to tell you, like, some players sort of leapt off the page or the ice at me. Ethan Zada, I thought, had a terrific game. A Niagara Ice Dogs player, Liram Amadovsky from North Bay, stood out to me. I thought Josh Glavin looked great on the blue line, of Saginaw player. I mean, I could list a whole bunch of them. But what strikes me is how impressive these players are when they are playing only amongst their peers. As you just touched on, these are projections, obviously. These are what may be the best and the brightest of the draft eligible players for this coming June's NHL entry draft, and they get to play only amongst the other 17-year-olds, with the exceptions of those 4 20-year-olds, 2 from each team that were there as overagers. And I'm still not sure how I feel about that. I guess, if the scouts want to see it, which is what we were told going in, then let the scouts see it. I don't know that it necessarily added anything to the game, but watching these players among their peers was pretty fun stuff. And you can certainly see there is a wealth of talent in this league. And maybe that's why there are 67 OHLers in the midseason rankings for the NHL Central Scouting, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, it was nice to see how many were legitimate prospects. I know sometimes when you have to go two teams deep, you're starting to stretch maybe, but for the most part, I thought everyone really acquitted themselves well. And it's a rare year too, Mike. When you look at it, you talk about how rare it is for a 17-year-old player to be a number one C in this league, but you've got Misa there. You've got so you look at the top of the scoring stats in the OHL right now, and there's a few draft eligibles there who happen to be in this prospect game. So it's not like it was just an easy going out there for these overagers either. But yeah, I thought the same, Mike. I thought a lot of them really leapt off the page, particularly the ones that used their speed. There, you saw some NHL skating. You mentioned Zada. I thought Luca Romano on his first goal used a lot of outside speed there. Those are the things that are going to jump out to the scouts watching. And then there's some that are the pace isn't quite in their game, right? And I thought I heard a few criticize some of the players that they thought weren't moving fast out there, but this is a learning experience for them. So they'll have to see what level they have to get to.
I didn't want to seem like too much of a homer, but the Kitchener Rangers that were in attendance, along with Romano, Cameron Reed, who arguably was the best player on the ice, period, and Adrian Misiljevic, all showed well for the team that I cover. The other thing about this game, as a prospects game, and what they're trying to show to every single scout in attendance, and I can assure you of that because I did a lap just before the broadcast began looking for somebody I wanted to have on the broadcast for an intermission. And that lap went around the concourse above the seats. And like you name it, the teams were represented. Obviously, you bring all the scouts into one central place in Brantford so they can watch these players on the ice. And there was some physicality. It's not just going to be, we thought maybe after the first period, the way the goals were being scored, this was going to finish 8-7. It didn't. It goes to overtime, 5-4 being the final score. But not just the physicality. There were several. I think if you count the last one as a fight, you'd count 4 fights in the game. And I'm okay with that 100%.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, by and large, I am as well. I know some of these players want to show that part of their game. I think the only dividing line I'd put in there for myself is some of them are obviously a little bit staged, a little bit. There was one where with a pretty early friendly tap out, it looked a little bit contrived. But hey, I mean, they're trying to do what they can to show the scouts what they've got, and a lot of these kids are friends. They know each other off the ice. So some of these things you expect to happen, but in these games, they've always had that physicality. They've got players wanting to show that that's part of their game, and for many of them, that's how they're going to make it to the pro level. So you will get that. It's not an all-star game.
It's absolutely not an all-star game. And it was a big day in the city of Brantford as well, because just ahead of the prospects game and the opening faceoff, they held the media conference to introduce the Hyman family as the new owners of the Bulldogs. And in case anybody was concerned about the future of the Ontario Hockey League in the city of Brantford, you can lay those concerns to rest because they announced a 15-year lease deal at the new arena in Brantford, which should be open maybe as early as 2027. So that's great, 15 years. And then another 5-year options to extend. So that's another 25 on top of the 15. Carry the one that says 40 years of OHL hockey in the Telephone City, which is far longer than the original Brantford franchise lasted. I think 6 or 7 years for the old Alexanders back in the day. So I think this is great all around. It was great for the city of Brantford. If you'll allow me, I'm going to pick a tiny nit here, and I don't want to come across as overly critical, but I'm going to say this because I really do think it's something the league needs to work on a little bit. And of course, at the prospects game this past week, Commissioner Brian Crawford was there. Had a chance to have a great chat with him. By the way, he's all for the physicality that was on display on the ice during that prospects game. And as you can imagine, he's feeling pretty darn good about where the league is at this moment, right? It was a great media conference. The Hymans come in as a new ownership family, saying all the right things, have a good track record when it comes to this sort of thing. Attendance is up across the league. The commissioner was telling me those expansion plans remain aggressive. I said, okay, but like what if? Because we know there have been some hurdles. What if there aren't new teams coming into the league next year? Well, then it'll just be the year after that. But he's bullish on expansion. He's bullish on where the league is at right now, which I think is great. He's got every reason to be. And this is the kind of energy and enthusiasm that comes with being a commissioner in his first year. Here's my but, and this is nothing against the city of Brantford, the Bulldogs franchise, which has been a model of success these past 10 years since Michael Andlauer owned it. Couple of championships. They've done great things in tight quarters in that Brantford Civic Center. But it's if this is where you're going to showcase your top prospects, if this is where you're going to put the spotlight on the league, I would have liked to see a little more pomp and circumstance around the game, quite frankly. You could have walked in. Well, I did walk into the building early, even earlier than I usually do for a broadcast, and you could have shot a cannon down the hallways. It was quiet. There wasn't anything to really indicate there was a big game happening that night. And then the building itself, again, I know what you're working with here, but it's got no area for scouts and media to gather ahead of time. There's no place to grab a coffee and make some notes. And then when it comes to the broadcast location for the visiting crew, which we were that night, we get squeezed into such a tight spot. And I know this is going to come across. I get it. And if you want to criticize, please feel free. I understand where you're coming from. I'm not trying to play the diva card here, but if you want the scouts that come to your rink to be in a better mood, just, give them a little something, a little warm cup of coffee, little place where they can gather and swap some stories or talk about players. And if you want the people who cover your league to be in a better mood, I mean, I am literally, this is not a joke, rubbing shoulders with the off ice official sitting next to me in the little teeny weeny corner that they have. Like, I can't even have my notebook out. There's so little space. So I'm sure in the new arena, which is going to be much more modern and much more spacious, they'll address these things. But this should be a little bit of a wake-up call, I think. It's a grown-up time for the Ontario Hockey League. It's time for it to look and act grown up in every one of its markets. I'll get off my soapbox, but really, it just leaves a little bit to be desired. And it's not the only rink in the league that has a couple of warts. Again, I get it. It's not a perfect situation right now. Not every market is a London or a Windsor or an Ottawa where they're building a new arena. Sudbury's building a new arena. Brantford's going to get that new arena. But if the league wants to be a grown-up league, it's got to take care of some of these little things along the way. I'm done. Off my soapbox.
Fair enough. In an event like this, there's always some lessons learned, Mike. And if you'll indulge me for a second too, I want to throw another one out there more on the positive side of the ledger. A couple kids from the U16 team I coach actually had the opportunity to go down and meet some of the players after the game and came back just absolutely raving about how great these players were. Particular shout out to, they thought Matt Schaefer was just terrific. And it's just a reminder that when you're in these positions as an OHL player, position of privilege to some extent, it takes so little to be kind and to give your time, and it means a whole lot to the people following the league. So these events kind of showcase a lot of things and some lessons learned. But one of the big takeaways for me from that, Mike, was these players are all ambassadors, and some of them are wearing it very well.
I think that's a great reminder to old cranky guys like me that through the lens of a U16 player, it looks a lot different, and that's awesome. And I'll tell you why Matt Schaefer came across as excellent to your young hockey players, Dan, because Matt Schaefer is excellent. Not only on the ice, which we've all seen, that guy is one whale of a human being. So all the time in the world for that young man, and I'm not surprised to hear that, but a great story. All right, let's go to the inbox early today because we got a great email from Ken, who is an Owen Sound fan. I know that because he signs off his email, Go Attack Go. Oh, by the way, if I could have gotten a better picture from my side of the rink across the rink, what a beauty picture it would have been, but it just didn't work out. At the Prospects game last week, there were two Kitchener Rangers fans in Rangers blue jerseys seated right next to two Owen Sound fans in Attack red jerseys. So the four of them, I don't know if it was friends that just cheer for different teams, but divisional opponents, two red, two blue, side by each in Brantford taking in the Prospects game. Looked fantastic. I wish I could have got a better picture to show it, but take my word for it. It was there and it looked great in Brantford. All right, to the email and send us one anytime. OHL podcast at Rogers.com. Ken said, as you mentioned on the podcast last week, the OHL trade deadline has passed. So, what can you talk about this week? Good question, Ken. So far, we've filled up about 15 minutes of bull owning. Can you touch on, Ken asks, any deadlines that are in place for players in the NCAA, USHL, etc., leaving and coming to an OHL team? Thanks. Love listening to the podcast. Flattery will get you everywhere. Ken, thank you very much for the email. Dan, I know we had to, dig a little bit beneath the surface on this one, but did you unearth anything interesting in this regard?
Yeah, only that you can actually, believe it or not, tinker with your roster well beyond the OHL trade deadline, which is January 10th. And you have till mid February actually to finalize your roster in terms of making those additions. So if you're thinking of another player coming from the NCAA or BCHL, you can actually add him to that roster till that point, assuming you have cards. Where it gets super complicated, though, Mike, is in what you're doing with players on your roster right now who might have to move to accommodate that new person. Because every league has its own deadlines. For instance, the GOJHL, where some of those players are assigned, is actually a little bit earlier than that. So these GMs they're not gonna want to push it to the last second. But this is why you might see, an import player or someone show up quite late and say, well, wait a minute, I thought the trade deadline passed. So it gets confusing, Mike, but there's still time.
Yes, and there is a caveat with all of that. So, first of all, when it comes to moving players to I hesitate to say down because there's such great hockey at all of these levels. But if you're going to put a player into the GOJHL, those rosters are set. So, movement in that direction isn't going to happen at this point. And for those players that will join your OHL club from the NC2A, from the BCHL, or the USHL, they can do that until mid-February if they have not played a game in their league since the trade deadline. So if they play
Yeah.
a game after January the 10th in whatever league it is that they are in, then they are not going to come to your OHL club. So if you're watching a prospect that the team drafted a couple of years ago and he might be playing NCAA, might be playing BCHL, USHL, whatever it is, just keep your eye on his game sheets. And if he plays a game since January the 10th, he won't be coming here. And the other wild card in all of this is if the player is playing pro. If the player is playing professional hockey anywhere, they can still be added to your team at any point from here on in, provided you make the room for them.
Yeah, so you're right. And that's actually a pretty big caveat you mentioned. So there's a lot of restrictions on that's why it's so rare to see someone added this late. And if they do come from another junior league, for instance, they'd have to be passed through waivers in order. So you can't just pick someone up from the WHL. So there's a lot of caveats, I suppose, but you don't see it. It's very rare. I think the most applicable time you'd see it is what you just referenced, Mike, is if a pro player decides to come back, like you look at, an Edward Chalet, for instance, in Kitchener, a player that's playing AHL or playing overseas decides to come back, and then there's the kind of carte blanche to get back in the lineup. But you won't see a whole lot of it, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
And you see this happen on very rare occasions. I think the simplest way to look at this, Ken, is if you're a fan of the Owen Sound Attack, which you have said in your email that you are, the team that you see is pretty much the team that you've got the rest of the way. If something happens, it would be on the rare side of things happening. But that's a bit of an overview of what the rules are like in putting those rosters together. Love getting your feedback. Send emails anytime. OHL podcast at Rogers.com. All right. As we move along with this week's episode, the Butler did it, but did what? We're not entirely sure. And we are watching every team in this league with our wraparound. So stay with us as we continue this week's episode of the OHL podcast. Playoffs? Yeah, we're talking about playoffs. You bet we are. Get in on the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Scoring touchdowns is key to winning in the playoffs, and you can score big by betting on them at DraftKings, the number one place to bet touchdowns. Ready to place your first bet? Try betting on something simple like a player to score 6. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app and make your pick. New DraftKings customers can bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code THPN. That's code THPN for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. Dan, it was a pretty vague statement from the Erie Otters just coming into last weekend's play. Following an internal investigation, head coach Stan Butler would not be traveling with the team. End of story. End of news release. End of statement. As I said, vague. I don't know it gets much more vague than that, but what do you say about what we heard or did not hear from the Erie Otters?
Yeah, it's tricky because these at the root are HR matters, personal HR staffing matters, like you'd have at any organization, and you feel like the employee's entitled to some privacy, and these matters are handled behind closed doors. Having said that, it's a very public league, and these are very public things. And when you make a statement like that, the issue I have is it kind of opens the floodgates to rumors and speculation, right? And you hear lots of things. Oh, he must have done this, or he must have done that. So one can only hope that it kind of gets clarified soon, because when you talk about violating the code of conduct or team policy, there's a whole range of things, Mike. I don't know if you've seen these team policies, but it's a whole range from very minor to very serious. So whatever this is, to leave your head coach home on a road trip, to me, would suggest it leans mid towards more serious on that scale. But again, all speculation. I hope we get it clarified fairly soon.
Yeah, see, and you just said something I think is really interesting in this, and that is code of conduct, because it said team policy, not code of conduct, which might be something within the team policy, or it might be something separate altogether. And I wondered the same thing. Is this a violation of the team's code of conduct? By extension, is this in any way a violation of the league's code of conduct or policy? Because they tend to be pretty similar. What's good for the team is good for the league and vice versa. So my real concern in this is with the vagueness of the statement, and it's a tough spot. I mean, crisis management 101 tells you to get out in front of the story. You own it before the internet or the hockey world owns it for you. So give Erie credit on doing that. They got out ahead of this instead of people wondering why the heck didn't Stan Butler make the trip through Ottawa, Peterborough, and Kingston this past weekend, and speculation go from there. The team got ahead of it by saying he's not going to be traveling because of this investigation that led to this violation of team policy. The problem is in the vagueness. And I think, to your point, Dan, they've just opened themselves up to a whole lot more questions. And now, what happens? Your point is well taken also when it comes to this being an HR matter, perhaps, and employees deserve a certain amount of privacy, but we play in a much different world, and you've made this much public. So if Stan Butler just suddenly shows up behind the bench at the next Erie Otters game, then do we just presume this all goes away? So it's a tough one. I credit the Otters for getting out in front of the story. I think, though, that they needed to give a little bit more of the story so we all understand. And also, when it comes to that kind of transparency around team policies and which policy may have been violated, that's a learning experience. As my father would call it, a teachable moment for all of us in the league.
Yeah, well said. Especially because if you look at the wording of that release too, it suggested that they're looking into a matter and it's ongoing, which would suggest follow up is coming. Correct. So all of the above, I think, is probably what we're going to see. Having said that, like you said, if he just shows up behind the bench at the next game, all forgiven, all forgotten, or is this going to be something where we're going to get further information in fairly short order once they've finished whatever investigation it is? So yeah, the vagueness has never sits well with many people, Mike. But I'd have to think we're going to get some answers soon.
This is one of the most winning coaches in Ontario Hockey League history with more than 800. I have never had a bad interaction with Stan Butler in my career, but it is a situation now where the Otters are kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. They opened the door this far. I think they're going to have to in some way tie a bow on this one and close it off for everybody's understanding. But that's going to mean, I don't know, at minimum, a follow up statement saying the investigation is now complete and Stan Butler has been reinstated. Or perhaps, if it's worse, it could be the end of Stan Butler in Erie. We just don't know right now.
Yeah, and the thing people forget in all of this too is this is a potentially positive PR thing too for the league. Everybody focuses on the negative side, but for these things to be addressed, whatever they are, and for follow up to happen, for me, if I'm a parent of a kid looking to come to the league and that recruitment piece, I'm happy with the league and teams that hold everyone to the team policy and code of conduct. So whatever it is, to me, it can be spun in positive ways as well, and I think that's probably what the league will be looking for here.
Look at you. You're Mr. Brightside here. You're the killers on this episode of the podcast. You're talking about Brantford being the best market in the league. I feel bad because I love the whole organization in Brantford, top on down. But I had to say what I wanted to say earlier when it comes to how the league operates, because it's having a moment, and I want it to live up to that moment. But your point here too, Dan, is spot on. The league obviously has the right people in place to govern not just the individual teams, but the league itself. And they're trying to make sure they have a clean house. So I guess what I'll leave it with is I look forward to what we next hear from Erie, because I'm sure after releasing what they released ahead of last weekend's games, we're going to hear something about the conclusion to this investigation, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, I would certainly hope so. I would expect the way it was worded that we'll get some follow up, and hopefully it's not as serious as some of the speculation you'll see.
There are 20 teams in this league, and we make sure we keep our eyes on each and every one of them. A little something we do every week on this podcast is called the wraparound. Dan and I alternate conferences, and this week Dan's turn is in the East. So we'll let you start things off, Dansky, with the Barrie Colts, I guess.
Yeah, sure. And all that panic we saw in Barrie, four straight losses, post deadline moves, and everyone was saying, "Well, what's going on in Barrie?" Well, calm down. A weekend where you have to play Windsor, and at the time, the first place Niagara Ice Dogs, you win them both. You win them both convincingly, 4-1 over Windsor, and a big 5-1 win in Niagara. Things are just fine in Barrie, Mike.
Okay, how did I become the jerk on this podcast? I was the one pointing out last week because I was on the east side. I'm like, oh, season long, 4-game losing streak, Barrie Colts, ha ha ha. And now look at you. Oh, everything's fine. Don't worry. Whatever Farwell said last week, just ignore it. Just ignore it.
You
Yeah,
can will it into existence, Mike. Remember when I said I needed positivity for Sarnia a couple weeks ago, and I got it? You can will it in.
bingo. Bingo. All right. For the Erie Otters in the West, defenseman Matthew Schaefer, a name that's already come up on this podcast. He got a warm greeting from fans in Brantford, because fans in Brantford are awesome. At the Connor McDavid OHL Top Prospects game last week, as you know, Schaefer has been sidelined with that injury suffered at the World Juniors. He's still in the conversation for first overall in the NHL. More on that when we talk about the midseason central scouting rankings. But he was on the bench in a suit and with his left arm in a sling during team introductions, and the crowd at the Civic Center in Brantford gave him a roaring ovation, perhaps one of the loudest we heard, save for the Bulldogs in that game. Schaefer also got to give a pretty good hype speech to the Western Conference team before the game as he called out the lineup. So it was a good news moment for Matthew Schaefer, even though he couldn't play. And just one other thing. Why do the schedule makers hate Erie? They went from Ottawa to Peterborough and then to Kingston on the weekend before heading home. That is a backwards way to do that trip, if I do say so myself.
True. Could be
Yeah,
worse, though. Could be worse.
it could
Yeah.
be worse, but you got to get Peterborough as the last one here. Like Ottawa, Kingston, Peterborough, because you're backtracking if you're going back to Kingston. Anyway, geography.
Yeah. Yeah. Geography is tough. Moving to Brampton, I think, as we all knew, as bodies start to filter back into this lineup, they're starting to look a lot more like the team you and I, Mike, both picked to finish near the top of that conference. And second worst in the league PK is starting to look a lot better now that you add one Connor Smith and Stevie Lescovar back into that lineup. Some size and power on that back end have made that lineup look a lot different.
In Flint, you've got suspensions. Injuries, even a cold and flu illness that are conspiring against the Firebirds since Christmas, as the team had to play, get this, 9 games in 15 days coming out of the break. That is a lot of hockey. Flint won 5 in a row heading into the break and started the second half with a win, but they have since lost 6 of 7.
Yeah. Well, turning to Brantford, I think a few of us were confused that the deadline was a little bit quiet. But how about a 3-3 weekend, Mike, with 6 points, all wins? And would you, for those of you saying, yeah, my team's done that too, would you be more impressed if I told you that included back to backs over the Oshawa Generals? Heck of a weekend for the Brantford Bulldogs.
Yeah, make it 6 in a row overall for the Poochies from the Telephone City. Speaking of quiet trade deadlines, well, it wasn't quiet overall in Guelph, where I'm headed next, but lots of rumors out there that Jet Luchenko was going to be traded away from the Storm. Not only was he not traded, but the Flyers prospect has been named the 33rd captain in Storm franchise history. For you history buffs out there, Todd Gleason and Alex Stoyanov were the Storm's first team captains back in 91-92, but it's Luchenko with the C now.
Congrats, Jet. Great and honor at that age. Moving down to Kingston, I hate to focus on too much on off ice things, but I think attendance is always a topic of concern there. And just want to say how nice it was to see more than 4,000 fans in that building on Friday night for their big win. Another big win today, over today being Sunday, over Erie. We'll keep seeing those crowds trend up in Kingston, and that's great to see because they got a heck of a team. And if they win their games in hand, could actually take over first in the East.
That's because Erie was wondering what the hell the schedule makers were doing to them on this trip. Ottawa, then to Peterborough, then back to Kingston. Yeah, add extra miles going home. I'm with you, though. Sorry, go ahead.
And where their coach was. So they're wondering both those things. But
That's right. Where's Stan Butler? It's not the same guy back there. Wes Wolf is really well dressed, though. I'm with you in Kingston. It's a great barn. The arena's in a perfect location. I've always wondered about the attendance numbers there. Glad to see them trending up. In Kitchener, Rangers forward Matthew Lachar sitting out his automatic 2-game suspension for exceeding the OHL's 3-fight limit. Lachar dropping the mitts with Flint's Josh Colosimo in Kitchener on Friday, after Colosimo laid a huge hit on the Rangers' Christian Humphreys. Now, we also have to give Colosimo credit earlier in the shift where he also rocked Lachar. That was a whale of a shift for Colosimo, and he stood in there with Lachar as well. If you're not familiar with the OHL's fighting rule, you get into a 4th fight, so you get 3 for a season, and then every fight after that comes with a 2-game suspension. And if you go too deep into the fighting, it's going to have a $1,000 team fine as well attached to it. Lachar is eligible to return on Friday when the Kitchener Rangers host the Owen Sound Attack.
Okay, and moving to Niagara, I know it's been topsy-turvy, the top of the Eastern Conference, but right as soon as they got first place again, they dropped a tough one at home to Barrie. However, I want to focus a little bit on the positive. I feel like I've talked a lot about Ryan Robrek, but how about hitting the 30-goal mark and 60-point barrier this weekend for a kid that is not draft eligible till next year? But unfortunately, the loss of Alex Asadurian, I believe, is going to hurt that team in the short term, so hopefully he's not out too long.
How about this story from London? 16-year-old rookie Jackson Cover made his OHL debut last Friday in a 6-0 win over Guelph. He finished the game with no points, a +1 rating. But here's the thing. Like, the real story here is that Cover has had what you might call an atypical hockey journey, only starting to play organized hockey a few years ago. Cover grew up in the Caribbean on Grand Cayman Island and played roller hockey and soccer at his first ice hockey game. And I have to distinguish that because he was not playing that back home. He didn't even know the rules. He kept going offside during his tryout. So he moves to Canada. He picks up ice hockey. And next thing you know, he's a 4th rounder to the London Knights last year, and he makes his OHL debut this past week.
Heck of an athlete there. So up in North Bay, Mike, I want to talk a little bit about twins that don't resemble each other, if that's fair. So
wait. The LeBlancs are twins. I've seen them in person.
Okay, so maybe I'm talking more metaphorically. They don't resemble each other. So so we've got defenseman Jacob, who some would have seen in that prospects game earlier this week, nearly a point a game with 39 and 41. And as older, I'm not sure. I think Andrew came out first. We'll call him older brother Andrew. Forward, 13 points on the season. A struggle for him in the Bay this year. So the Twins going in opposite directions with their seasons.
Yeah, and Andrew was the first rounder into this league, Jacob the third, but those Twins are joined at the hip for sure. They're headed off to school together next year, too. In Owen Sound, the Attack pick up their first win in 5 years over the Steelheads, and they did it in rather dramatic fashion. The Attack scored 4 unanswered goals in Brampton to come back from a 4-1 third period deficit, and they won it in overtime on a goal by captain Landon Hookey. Rookie Michael Deck, who you might remember we talked about a few weeks back on the pod because he scored his first OHL goal in his first OHL game back in December. He was recalled for the weekend, and he tied that game in Brampton with 34 seconds remaining in order to force OT. Couple of other quick notes, too. One, a nod to goaltender Matthew Kaprowski, who earned Save of the Night honors at the Prospects game. A gorgeous glove save off Ethan Zada in overtime. And Thunder Bay native Easton Mikas scored his first OHL goal in Owen Sound's loss on Saturday at home to Flint.
Love those stories.
I do too.
Yeah. Switching back to Oshawa, I know in that battle for the top of the Eastern Conference, their fans were not thrilled with the way things went in their home and home with Brantford. A tough weekend. Having said that, chin up, Oshawa fans. 7 of your next 10 games in that battle for first place are against teams that are in the bottom quarter of the league. So time to make some headway for the Oshawa Generals.
It is that time of year, too, where the teams that loaded up or the teams that sold off, I mean, it's certainly, you get results that are expected. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, to Saginaw, where Zane Parekh now stands alone. The Spirit defenseman not only put up 5 points in a win over Guelph with a hat trick plus 2 assists, but he also reached 183 career OHL points. That is the most ever by a Spirit defenseman. Parekh passes Patrick McNeil for the record, who spent his entire OHL career in Saginaw and was drafted by Washington in the 4th round, but never played an NHL game. McNeil, however, did win back-to-back Calder Cups with the AHL's Hershey Bears. But Zane Parekh passes McNeil. Parekh, of course, a Calgary Flames prospect, and the most points ever by a Spirit defenseman.
And Parekh could be back next year, by the way. So
could be. Yes, sir.
Mike, are you a Tom Petty fan?
Are you kidding me? I will argue. I will argue that Into the Great Wide Open was a better album than Full Moon Fever. Fight me on it. I'll go with you.
Well, you know what? They were both great. But I'm going to take one from the latter and talk about their theme song for the Ottawa 67s, which is Free Fallin'. That's where I was going with this. That is where I was going with this. 1 win in the last 10, Mike, and injuries setting in as well. Though, to calm the folks in the nation's capital, I think many are okay with this. It's been a run of good seasons, and it's time to regroup, get a high pick or two. The rest of the season might be a little rough, though.
More rough than it is now? Like a little rougher?
Let's just say consistently rough. How's that?
All right. Throw them a parachute if they're free falling. Come on. In Sarnia, Matthew Manza made the most of his OHL debut, scoring in the Sting's 5-2 win over Sudbury. The 17-year-old was signed last week by Sarnia after spending last year with the Toronto Patriots of the OJHL. Manza had 49 points in 49 games last year and was named the OJ's Rookie of the Year. He's committed to Ohio State University, but he is now officially an OHL goal scorer.
Welcome to the club.
Yes, sir.
All right, in Peterborough, don't want to be very negative here, but I also want to point out something that's trending, which is that they might end up with one of the lowest scoring top scorers in league history. Currently, Jonathan Malia and Aiden Young tied atop the Peterborough Pete's scoring list with 21 points through and into the 40s worth of games right now, Mike. So not a whole lot of games left, trending to be in the low 30s, which would be a staggeringly low top scorer for an OHL club.
That is a fantastic piece of trivia right there. Lowest top scorer in league history. Really?
Yeah, well, I was trying to do so the records go back pretty far, Mike, trying to dig it out, but it seems like there's not many. It's hard to find any that were down in the 30s as a top scorer on a team, Mike. So we're possibly going to get that this year. All
right, and I'm fine if you want to be a little bit negative. I can't be the only one on this podcast. Come on. In Sault Ste. Marie, Nolan Lalonde's first win as a Greyhound was a shutout. Now, that was when the Sioux blanked the Petes. Here come the Petes again. 7-0 last Thursday. As you know, Lalonde was acquired at the deadline in the deal that the Sioux made, sending Charlie Schenkel to Kingston. But here's what's even more interesting about Lalonde's shutout last week. It was the Sioux's 7th all-time shutout versus Peterborough. And 3 of those 7 lifetime shutouts have come in the past 4 games. I'm not here to give you betting advice, but 3 out of the last 4 Sioux Peterborough games have ended in a shutout for the Sioux. Just look at the schedule next year. Do with that as you wish. Lalonde followed up that shutout with another one against Ottawa. He has not allowed a goal now in almost 7 periods of hockey.
Nice turnaround right there.
You betcha.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to end in Sudbury, Mike, and I'm not going to bring up the 8-1 loss to London. I will not do it. I'm just going to. It's something that makes me curious, Mike, when I see these things. Whenever a team at the deadline goes out and acquires the league's leading penalty minute getter, which the Sudbury Wolves did when they got Noah Roberts from Brantford, you wonder what the thought process is. Did we need to get bigger and tougher? Seemed like they had plenty of that. But I think that one of the league's better PKs is one of the reasons they had no problem doing that, Mike.
Is it just me, or do you think London like toys with teams? I only looked at that scoreboard today, but my goodness, 8-1. Like, it's like they get up on you and then just like, we're going to make you regret making the trip to London, right? It's one trip a year for Sudbury, and the Knights just pounded on them.
Yeah, and watched a bunch of that game, Mike, and it got pretty testy in the middle of the game. It was actually relatively close, I believe 2-1 at that point. A couple fights broke out, and then I think maybe you woke up the sleeping giant, because sometimes when things get nasty, you're walking into London's den there, and they took it over from there.
I was just up in Sudbury not long ago. Dale Hunter's banner still hangs proudly. I don't know. I'm not recommending they take it down. Just remember that when you go back home, you Sudbury Wolves. And I'll finish up the West in Windsor, where AJ Spellacy played career game number 150 last week, an 8-6 win over Flint. And how about import Ilya Protas notching goal number 30 last week? Both players, Spellacy and Protas, NHL third rounders. Spellacy to Chicago, Protas to Washington. And just to finish that thought off, Protas was one of 5, count them, 5 Windsor Spitfires who couldn't answer the bell for the game versus Oshawa to close out the weekend. They played in Barrie on Saturday, sent home because there's an illness running through the Spitfires team. So, boy, oh boy, that's a tough way to go.
It gives you a rough roster to try and play a game with against a great team like Oshawa, but I think it's the right thing to do, Mike. We know what these things do to dressing rooms when you let them get out of hand, so get ahead of it.
100%. And it's one thing injury, another thing illness, and they can run through teams in a hurry. That is for sure. And that is your weekly wraparound as Dan and I keep our eyes on every team in the league, including the one you cheer for. Now, you also know that we give you a prospect to watch every week on this podcast. Now, the NHL is giving you theirs, and we've got both of those things coming up for you on this week's episode of the OHL podcast. Dan, NHL Central Scouting is out with its mid-season rankings. We find 67 Ontario Hockey League players in those rankings. I count 5 from both Saginaw and Brampton, 4 from London, Brantford, Kitchener. I could keep going and going, but 67, more than 5 dozen OHLers, are in the midseason rankings from NHL Central Scouting.
Yeah, and that jives with the eye test and everything we're seeing and hearing, Mike, right? That this is a really, really strong year for the OHL. And if I could just focus for a second on the top end of that, how many times have you seen one feeder league? You talk about, the OHL, the WHL, the QMJHL, you've got the USHL, you've got the US National Team Development Program, you've got the NCAA, et cetera, BCHL. All of those feeder leagues didn't even touch on Europe. And you could have 3 OHLers in the top 5 if things fall just right with Schaefer, Martone, and Misa. It might not happen, but you're going to get those three going in the top 6 or 7 anyway. So what a remarkable year for the OHL, Mike.
It really is. And you look at Schaefer, who's number 1 despite the injury, another defenseman who is, I would argue, very Schaefer-like and picked up the Western Conference Player of the Game award at the Connor McDavid OHL Top Prospects game this past week in Cameron Reed. I've heard from a number of people, Dan, that yes, Reed comes in ranked 27th on that list, but they've got him slotted a lot higher on their boards right now. Again, this is NHL Central Scouting. It's one guide. There are several other guides out there, but the OHL is really coming to the fore here with those 67 names. And these players now still have that opportunity till they get to the final rankings to increase their draft stock, if you will. But very, very high end talent this time around for the OHL, no question about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it's not just so Cameron Reed's phenomenal NHL level skater right now, but you look at Jake O'Brien, Kashawn Aitchison. You've got a number of players that are going to flirt. Well, Brady Martin is just almost pro ready the way he plays the game right now. So you've got a number of these kids, Mike, that are one of these names is going to pop up and surprise you on NHL draft day. It's going to be someone that said was ranked 22nd or 18th, and they're going to get drafted ninth or something really, really high. So, yeah, you're going to see a lot of scouts during the last few months in playoffs in this league, Mike.
Remember Beckett Seneca at last year's draft. Maybe something like that will happen again as Dan Mahar sees it. And remember, when those scouts come to your rink, just give them a place to do a little bit of work. A bite to eat wouldn't hurt. Warm cup of coffee. Put them in a good mood when they're looking at your player. I know that the interviews have begun as well. I've seen some players pulled aside after games to have conversations with teams because it's got so much more to do with than just the play on the ice, right? They want to know what kind of person you are, especially if they are using a first round pick on you. So interesting times indeed. But when you're at the rink, look for the people in the black jackets because those would be is it a dress code that I just never got the memo for? Not that I'm a scout, but every single one, it's the same thing all the time. Must be easy to clean, or when they spill mustard on it. And you know who I'm talking about spilling mustard on their scouting jacket, but it's the same. Every rink you go to, look for the guys with the black jackets. They're the scouts.
They think they're incognito, Mike, but it's quite the opposite.
Exactly. Now you're sticking out like sore thumbs, you guys. You're sticking out like sore thumbs. All right. From NHL Central Scouting's mid-season rankings, 67 OHLers on there. The prospects that Dan and I watch for you every week. We like to give you something or a player that caught our attention that you can also watch coming up on the NHL draft, which is in June. Let me just stop right now. Dan, who do you have for your prospect of the week?
Well, I did just that, Mike. I just went with a player that caught my eye, and he's a little bit off the radar right now in terms of those rankings. But that's in the sea of talent and veteran talent that we see in the Brampton Steelheads right now. One guy that caught my eye was Kieran Witkowski. Tireless work ethic, trying to get himself noticed out there. And despite some limited ice time based on the lineup, 4 points in the last 5 games too, Mike. So starting to get noticed in Brampton. So I like Kieran Witkowski this week. Mike, who you got?
I think it's important to remind folks now that Dan and I do not discuss these things in advance. But I'm also in Brampton, not with Witkowski, though, although I like where you're going with that. Kid's got some jam, too. But I'm looking at Jack Ivankovic this week as my prospect of the week, having seen him a couple of times now, so maybe some recency bias. But he did not allow a goal at the prospects game, and then he made 33 saves and allowed just one goal against the Kitchener Rangers a day after being beaten for 5 and a loss. So I like the way he rebounded and put in a really solid game against a very good team in the West. And now you look at the past 5 games, which coincidentally is since the trade deadline. And that's where Brampton went out and added I think, a bit of an insurance policy with Braden Gillespie, somebody they don't mind turning to, and maybe, just maybe, takes a little bit of pressure off of Ivan Kovic, who knows he's carrying the mail for the Steelheads. But those past 5 games, a 3-2 record and a 2.8 goals against and a 910 save percentage, trending above his season-long numbers. So I like the way Ivan Kovic is playing, and he gets my nod as prospect of the week.
Well, I can tell you this much, Mike. The Kitchener Rangers have seen enough of Mr. Ivan Kovic for a while.
You take those 2 games alone, and yeah, the Rangers, especially the game in Kitchener almost 2 weeks ago now, he was extremely good, and he was everything the Steelheads needed to rebound from that home ice loss. So listen, and while we're on this, since we both picked Brampton players, and I know you had the chance to be in the rink for the Rangers Steelheads game, I like what they're doing in Brampton. And I was talking to some of the let's just call them the Bramptonians before the game, especially, and I should have done this at the beginning. Kevin, thank you very much for your kind words about the podcast. And in Brantford, my goodness, it was like a love fest. I almost didn't make it onto the air, but Scott, and I'm pretty sure, I think it was Jeremy. If it wasn't Jeremy, it was Brandon, but I don't know how I get those two names mixed up. Pretty sure it was Jeremy. Anyway, thank you. Everywhere I'm going these days, people say, we love listening to the podcast. Love you for that. Some of the Bramptonians before the game, when I was there with the Rangers this past Saturday, I was getting my bearings because I haven't been there in so long since the battalion left over a decade ago. So I'm asking, where's this, where's that? And I asked where the media room was. And some of the guys are like, oh, this is embarrassing. It's not even, you know what? It was great. Plenty of space to sit down, make notes. They had some coffee. They had a slice of pizza. I thought they were great. But the atmosphere really is lacking, isn't it, Dan? That arena, it just, I know it's an old story, but boy, oh boy, you had two good hockey teams in there. It was a pretty darn good hockey game, and just no atmosphere at all.
Which I don't get. Easy to get to, great seats, great sight lines. I had the opportunity to talk to a couple of the Steelhead season ticket holders on during the game, and great people. Like, the atmosphere was terrific. They appreciated the visitors. They were right into the game. They knew the players. It was terrific, and I couldn't help but wonder, where are your friends? Where are your neighbors? Bring them out here. Like, they're missing out, and it felt wrong to me that many of these people didn't have neighbors in the seats. It was 2 here, 4 there. There wasn't that atmosphere, that collegial, that get the crowd going type atmosphere. It was just a bunch of hockey fans kind of isolated in pockets that just liked the hockey. And I'd love to see a lot more join in.
Yeah, they should. They're missing a great product. We know that. Like I said, this is an old story, but they haven't really embraced junior hockey in the GTA since the Toronto Marlboros left Maple Leaf Gardens back in the day. And that's the truth of it all. You'd go see the Marlies on a Saturday afternoon and stick around for the Leafs that night at Maple Leaf Gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, when you talk about the hockey history in the GTA in general, it just, to me, it's ludicrous. I will never get my head around it. And I heard someone make the argument on the weekend that, oh, it's demographics. Yeah, but the demographics have changed dramatically over the years, but the lack of support for junior hockey there has been consistent for quite a while. So there's other factors at play. I don't get it, because it's a great product. Like, the talent on that team right now. We saw the banner hung, Mike, for the 2017 Steelheads in Mississauga, and just took the occasion to look up that roster again. I believe there's 8 current NHLers came off that roster, and you think that's crazy. Like, you're watching the future of the NHL right here, and several of these kids on the Steelheads right now are going to be in the NHL very shortly. Some of them very higher end. So it just doesn't make any sense to me that people won't plop down the $25 to go watch it.
They'll pay $250 or more to go watch it at Scotiabank Arena, and there are 18,000 of them. We're looking get 4,000 into the CAA Center. I mean, it really doesn't add up from where I'm sitting, but it never has, and maybe that's something we explore further at another time. You've got thoughts? Hey, share them with us via email, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. We love to hear from you. Please, Dan just mentioned bringing friends to games. Tell a friend about this show. Like, subscribe, give us a review. We're happy for all of it. And we'll be back in your ears 1 week from now on the OHL podcast.